Walk into a working-class British kitchen in 1953, and you would find no bins overflowing, no half-used jars in the back of a cupboard, no bread going green on the side. There was a reason for that. Every scrap, every stub, every drop had a second life waiting for it, because in most homes there simply was no money to throw away. These were not quaint eccentricities. They were survival, worked out shilling by shilling around the kitchen table. Some of these habits would horrify a modern shopper. Others we have quietly begun copying again without knowing where they came from. We are counting down 20 forgotten British habits that poor families used to stretch a wage until it screamed. Let's begin with number 20. Number 20. Brown paper and string, folded and kept. In a time before sticky tape lived in every drawer, the brown paper a parcel arrived in was treated like treasure. Housewives untied the knots carefully rather than cutting them, smoothed the creased sheets flat with a warm hand, and pressed them under a heavy book or the leg of a chair until they were needed again. The string was wound into a tight ball that lived on a hook by the back door, growing fatter month by month. By the early 1950s, a fresh ball of household string cost only a few pence, but pennies were exactly what a family did not have to spare. That same paper wrapped the children's sandwiches, lined a cake tin, covered school books, and finally lit the fire. Nothing that came into the house left it without doing 3 or 4 jobs first. The ritual of saving string became so ordinary that families laughed about it for generations. Yet behind the joke was a hard truth. When money was tight, even the wrapping was worth keeping. Number 19. Reusing the tea leaves. Tea was sacred in a British home, but it was also dear, and a good housewife made a spoonful stretch far past its first cup. Loose leaves were tipped back into the caddy after a weak second brew, or dried on the windowsill and used again when the tin ran low near payday. Even spent, the leaves earned their keep. Damp tea leaves were scattered across the parlor carpet before sweeping, trapping the dust so it did not fly up into the air, then brushed away to leave the room smelling faintly of the pot. In the 1950s, a quarter pound of tea cost around 1 shilling and 6pence, enough to make the difference between a comfortable week and a lean one. Children were sent to the corner shop with a note and a few coppers, told to buy only what was needed. The tea ritual carried on regardless, a small daily comfort. But the leaves that made it were worked twice, sometimes 3 times, before they were finally let go. Number 18. Newspapers' 1,000 uses. No single object worked harder in a poor household than yesterday's newspaper. Once the news had been read, and read aloud to those who could not, the pages began a long second career. Torn into neat squares and threaded onto a loop of string, they hung on the nail in the outside privy, standing in for the toilet paper many families could not justify. Crumpled sheets polished the windows to a streakless shine, with nothing but a splash of vinegar. Fish and chips came home wrapped in them. Muddy boots were stuffed with them to dry by the fire. Layers of newspaper went under the lino to keep the cold from rising through the flags, and more went between the blankets on the bitterest nights. A daily paper cost barely more than a penny, yet it heated homes, cleaned them, and clothed the floors. When at last a sheet was too soft to serve, it was rolled and knotted into a firelighter. Even then, it was still working. Number 17. Candle stubs never thrown away. Before every home had reliable electric light, and long after in the poorest streets, the candle end was a thing of value. When a candle burned down to a useless stub, too short to hold a flame safely, it was dropped into a tin, kept for the purpose rather than binned. Once the tin was full, the stubs were melted down together in an old pan set over the range. the wicks fished out, and the soft wax poured around a length of new wick into a jam jar or an old cup. A fresh candle was reborn for nothing. Even the tiniest scraps had jobs of their own. Rubbed along a sticking drawer or a stiff window sash, wax made them slide sweetly again. Smeared on the teeth of a saw, it stopped the blade from binding. In a household where a box of candles was a considered purchase, letting wax go to waste was almost unthinkable. Every flame was made to burn right down to the last. Number 16. Turning shirt collars and cuffs. A working man's shirt wore out in a predictable order. The body of it stayed sound for years, but the collar and cuffs, rubbed by neck and wrist and scrubbed hardest on wash day, frayed long before the rest. Rather than condemn a whole shirt for 2 worn edges, the housewife reached for her scissors and unpicked the collar entirely, turning it over so the frayed side faced inward and the good side showed, then stitching it back down by hand. The same was done with the cuffs. A shirt that looked finished was suddenly good for another year of Sundays. In the 1950s, a decent shirt could cost the better part of a week's spare money, so the few hours at the machine or with a needle were hours well spent. Oral histories from the era recall mothers sitting up after the children were in bed, turning collars by lamplight. It was quiet, patient work, invisible to everyone who saw the man wear it. But it was the difference between smart and shabby, made from thread alone. Number 15. Darning socks and stockings. A hole in a sock was not a reason to buy new socks. It was an evening's small task, done with a wooden mushroom slipped inside the heel to hold the shape, and a needle threaded with wool saved from an unraveled jumper. The darn was woven, not merely stitched, warp threads laid first, and then weft threaded over and under until the hole was closed with a neat little patch of fresh wool. Done well, you could barely feel it underfoot. Every home had a darning basket, and every girl was taught to use it young, often at school in domestic science lessons. Stockings, precious and expensive, were mended the same way, and a laddered pair was rescued with a dab of clear nail varnish to stop the run before it spread. A single pair of hand-knitted socks represented hours of somebody's labor, so wearing them until they truly fell apart was only common sense. Families measured thrift not by what they bought, but by how long they could keep from buying again. Number 14. Rag rugs from worn-out clothes. When a garment was finally past all mending, turning and patching, it still did not reach the bin. It became a rug. On winter evenings, the whole family might gather around a stretched square of hessian, often an old sugar or potato sack, while worn shirts, trousers, and blankets were cut into short strips called clippings. Using a peg or a sharpened bone, each strip was hooked or pegged through the hessian, packed tight until a thick, warm rug took shape. The result was a hearth rug that cost nothing but the evenings spent making it, laid before the fire where the family stood and the children played. Every rug was a patchwork of the household's history. There was Dad's old work jacket, a strip of a dress a daughter had outgrown, the blanket that had finally worn through. In mining and mill towns, the making of a proddy or clippy mat was a shared ritual, passed from mother to child. The clothes had one last winter of use in them yet, warming the very floor the family walked on. Number 13. Saving every jar, tin, and bottle. In a poor household, nothing that could hold something else was ever discarded. Glass jam jars were washed and stacked on the pantry shelf, waiting for the summer glut of fruit or a batch of pickles. Empty tobacco and toffee tins held buttons, screws, hairpins, and the precious rainy day coppers. Old bottles were rinsed and returned to the shop for the penny or two deposit. A small but reliable trickle of money that children guarded jealously. A sturdy biscuit tin became the family's document box, keeping the rent book and the insurance papers dry. Nothing was bought to store things in, because the packaging that came free with something else did the job perfectly well. Oral histories are full of the button tin, that heavy rattling treasure passed around the family for generations, and the drawer of neatly folded tins that no household seemed able to be without. It was not hoarding. It was a working system, built on the certainty that a container saved today would be needed tomorrow. Number 12. Cardboard in worn-out shoes. Shoes were among the dearest things a poor family bought, and children grew out of them or wore through them with maddening speed. When the sole finally wore thin and a hole appeared, the answer was not the cobbler, at least not straight away, but a piece of stout cardboard cut to the shape of the inside of the shoe and slipped in to cover the gap. It kept the wet out for a while and the cold at bay, and it was replaced whenever it soaked through. A cereal packet or an old shoebox provided an endless free supply. Children walked to school on cardboard soles and thought nothing of it, because most of the street did the same. When a proper repair could at last be afforded, fathers often did it themselves, tacking on a new sole and heel bought from the ironmonger with a last and a hammer kept for the purpose. The shoes were made to last until the very last foot had outgrown them, then passed down again. A hole was a problem to be managed, never a reason to spend. Number 11. Bones boiled for stock. No bone left a poor kitchen without giving up everything it had. The carcass of the Sunday chicken, the bone from a joint of ham, the trimmings the butcher threw in for next to nothing, all went into the big pot on the range with an onion, a carrot, and whatever else was going soft in the vegetable rack. Hours of gentle simmering drew out a rich, savory stock that became the foundation of the week's soups and gravies. A ham bone was worked hardest of all, flavoring pot after pot of pea and lentil soup until it was finally boiled white. In an age when a stock cube was still a small luxury and tinned soup a treat, this free liquid gold was what stood between many families and a thin, joyless dinner. The smell of bones simmering was the smell of a house being run properly. Mothers knew that the last scrap of goodness clinging to a bone, coaxed out over a slow flame, could turn a handful of vegetables into a meal that filled every seat at the table. Number 10. Stale bread that was never, ever wasted. A loaf was too dear and too central to daily life for a single crust to be thrown away. Yesterday's bread simply changed jobs. Slices going hard were toasted or fried in a little dripping for breakfast, or soaked in milk and egg for a pudding. Harder still, and it was grated into breadcrumbs, kept in a jar to coat fish and stretch the mince in rissoles and meatloaf. Truly stale ends were dropped into soup to thicken it, or torn up for the birds only when they were fit for nothing else. Bread and butter pudding? Bread pudding heavy with dried fruit, summer pudding pressed with berries. These beloved dishes existed precisely because no cook could bear to bin a loaf. By the early 1950s, bread was a daily purchase and a substantial part of the food budget, so wasting it felt close to sinful. A good housewife could tell you 5 things to do with a stale loaf without pausing for breath. And her family ate well on every one of them. Number 9. Soap slivers pressed into new bars. A bar of soap was used down to a paper-thin sliver, and even then it was not thrown away. The little slivers were collected in a dish by the sink, and once enough had gathered, they were softened in warm water and pressed firmly together into a new patchwork bar that lasted another week or more. Some households kept a small wire soap cage or shaker, a little basket on a handle that held the scraps and could be swished through hot water to make a cheap, bubbly wash for the dishes. Nothing about a bar of soap was allowed to slip down the plug hole unused. Hard yellow household soap was bought in long bars and cut into pieces as needed, one block serving the washing, the floors, the dishes, and the family alike. Every fragment counted. To let a usable sliver melt away in a soap dish was a small carelessness that a careful home simply did not permit, because those slivers, gathered up, added up to a whole bar not bought. Number 8. Preserving eggs in water glass. Hens laid well in spring and summer, and barely at all in the dark of winter, when eggs grew scarce and dear at the shop. So in the months of plenty, when eggs were cheap and fresh, thrifty households laid them down for the lean times. Fresh, unwashed eggs were lowered carefully into a bucket or crock of water glass, a solution of sodium silicate that sealed the porous shells and kept the eggs good for many months. A large pail could hold dozens, tucked away in the cold of the pantry or the cellar. When winter came and the hens stopped, those preserved eggs went into cakes, puddings, and Yorkshire batter as if it was still June. Ministry of Food advice during and after the war urged families to preserve their surplus this way, and many carried on long after rationing ended. It took a little care and forethought, choosing only perfect eggs and turning the crock now and then, but the reward was eggs on the table in February bought at summer prices. It was housekeeping as quiet insurance. Number 7. Storing apples wrapped in newspaper. Come autumn, gardens and allotments gave up more apples than any family could eat at once, and the windfalls bruised and spoiled within days. The answer was patient and simple. Each sound, unblemished apple was wrapped individually in a square of newspaper and laid, not touching its neighbors, in a single layer in a wooden box or drawer kept somewhere cool and dark, a shed, a cellar, or an unheated back bedroom. Wrapped this way, the fruit could not pass on its rot, and a good store of cookers and keepers lasted well into the new year. Every week or two the boxes were checked, and any apple beginning to turn was pulled out before it spoiled the rest. The old saying about one bad apple being hard-won kitchen wisdom rather than a mere phrase. Free fruit picked in September became crumbles, pies, and stewed apple with custard in the depths of January, long after the shops charged a premium. It cost nothing but a few sheets of newspaper and the care to wrap each one, and it kept a family in pudding through the winter. Number 6. Sharing the bath water. Hot water was expensive, whether it came from a coal-heated copper, a temperamental back boiler, or kettles boiled one after another on the stove. So on bath night, and for many homes there was only one a week, the same water served the whole family in turn. The tin bath was dragged in front of the fire and filled, and in went the cleanest first, usually the youngest children, then the older ones, then the parents, each bathing in the water that had gone before. The phrase about not throwing the baby out with the bath water came from a time when the water by the end was murky enough that you might genuinely lose sight of what was in it. Even then, the water was not simply poured away. It was used to scrub the kitchen floor or the front step, or carried out to the garden. Filling a bath took real effort and real money in fuel, so every drop was made to work. It sounds hard to modern ears, but it was simply how a household without endless hot water made bath night possible at all. Number 5. Burning the coal slack and riddling the cinders. Coal was the lifeblood of the home and a heavy weight on the weekly budget, so not a single lump was wasted. When the fire burned down, the ashes were never just shoveled out and binned. They were riddled through a metal sieve or a fire shovel with holes, the fine ash falling away while the half-burnt cinders were saved and burned again the next day. The cheapest coal of all was slack, the dusty small stuff that many looked down on. But a canny householder mixed it with a little water and clay or old tea leaves and molded it into balls or a solid mass that banked the fire and made it burn slow and long through the night and into the morning. Ash itself was useful, scattered on icy paths, dug into the garden, or spread on the vegetable plot. Children were sent along the railway lines and slag heaps to pick up fallen coal for the family fire. Every scrap of fuel was chased down and burned to nothing, because warmth, like everything else, cost money that could not be spared. Number 4. Growing vegetables and keeping a few hens. The back garden and the allotment were not hobbies but larders. A patch of ground turned over to potatoes, cabbages, carrots, beans, and onions could feed a family for months and shave a real sum off the food bill. The dig for victory spirit of the war years lived on long afterward, and by the 1950s, allotments were still crowded with men growing rows of vegetables after a long shift, and swapping seeds and gluts over the fence. Many kept a few hens as well, feeding them on kitchen scraps and vegetable peelings so that nothing was truly wasted, the peelings becoming eggs and eventually a Sunday roast. Some streets ran a pig club, fattening a pig on communal scraps to be shared out at slaughter. What the garden produced went straight to the table or into jars for winter, at a fraction of shop prices and fresher than anything money could buy. It was hard, dirty, patient work, but it turned spare ground and spare food into meals, and it gave a family a measure of security no wage packet alone could offer. Number 3. Make do and mend, and hand it all down. Clothing passed through a family like water through a mill, and nothing was bought that could be made from something already owned. A father's worn trousers were cut down for a boy. A woman's old dress became a pinafore for a daughter, then a blouse, then a duster, then a strip in a rag rug. Jumpers that had worn through at the elbow were unraveled entirely, the crinkled wool washed and rewound and knitted into something new: gloves, socks, a smaller jumper for a younger child. Younger children lived in the outgrown clothes of the older ones and thought nothing of it, and those clothes were passed on again to cousins and neighbors when the last of the family had grown out of them. The wartime Make Do and Mend campaign had taught skills that poverty made permanent, and every mother could patch, take in, let out, and turn a garment inside out. New clothes were for Sundays, weddings, and growing feet only. Everything else was made, mended, and passed along until it had given every last thread of use. Number 2. Bottling and jamming the glut. When summer and autumn brought a flood of cheap or free fruit and vegetables, the wise household did not simply eat what it could and let the rest rot. It preserved. Kitchens filled with steam and the smell of boiling sugar as blackberries picked free from the hedgerows, plums from the garden tree, and cheap market gluts were turned into jars of jam that sealed the taste of summer away for the year. Runner beans were salted down in stone jars, eggs were preserved, chutneys simmered on the stove, and fruit was bottled in kilner jars to see the family through the barren months. A jar of homemade jam cost a fraction of a shop-bought one and tasted of the family's own labor. The Women's Institute built much of its reputation on this very skill, and its jam and preserve competitions were fierce. Nothing edible was allowed to go to waste in season, because a shelf lined with gleaming jars in October meant puddings, sandwiches, and sweetness right through the winter, bought with foraged fruit and an afternoon's work rather than money. Number 1. The housekeeping tins on the mantelpiece. And at the very top of this list sits the habit that held all the others together, the careful dividing of every wage into its separate tins. On payday, the money came home, and before a single penny was spent, it was portioned out into a row of tins or jars kept on the mantelpiece or in the dresser drawer, each labeled for its purpose. One for the rent, one for the coal and gas, one for the insurance man who called each week, one for boots and clothing, and one, if there was anything left, for the little treats that made life bearable. The food money was what remained, and the whole art of housekeeping was making it stretch to Friday. If a tin ran short, the family went without rather than raid the rent, because falling behind on the rent was the road to the street. Women ran these household economies with a precision that would shame a bank, remembering every penny in and out without ever writing it down. This was where the dripping jar, the saved string, the darned socks, and the bottled fruit all came together. All of it in service of making the tins balance. It was not meanness. It was love, counted out coin by coin, so that the rent was paid, the children were fed, and the family kept its dignity through the hardest of times. So there you have it, 20 forgotten habits that kept the wolf from the door when there was nothing to spare. Which of these did your own Nan swear by, and which have you quietly started doing yourself? Let me know in the comments, and if this stirred a memory or two, you know what to do.